Morning came quickly on the island. By sunrise, the beach was already hot, and the survivors of the Argosy were hard at work. What remained of the ship had been sorted into piles. Food in one, medical supplies in another. Anything useful for building shelter went into a third. Jack Mercer walked along the beach, inspecting the work. "We're going back to the wreck." Dr. Reed looked up from a crate. "Today?" "Today." Professor Finch turned from the jungle. "I thought we had more important matters to discuss." Jack gave him a look. "We do." He pointed toward the ocean. "Getting home." Finch frowned. "The mountain can wait." "But, Captain, we have discovered ruins belonging to a civilization unknown to modern archaeology. There is an enormous sealed chamber beneath the mountain, and we have evidence that a previous expedition—" "Professor." Jack held up a hand. "I want to know what's behind that door, too." Finch blinked. "Then why?" "Because we have 17 people sleeping on a beach." Jack pointed toward the ocean again. "And our ship is sitting out there with supplies we might need." Reed nodded. "He's got you there." Finch sighed. "I suppose." Jack looked at him. "Tomorrow, if we have enough food and a way to defend ourselves, I'll go back with you." "Tomorrow?" "If nothing else goes wrong." Reed laughed. "That's a dangerous thing to say on this island." Jack smiled. "Then let's hope the island wasn't listening." They gathered their equipment. Jack took a rifle. Reed carried the medical bag. Finch brought the expedition journal. Jack noticed. "You bringing that?" "Of course. We're going to the wreck." "I know." "Then why bring the journal?" Finch tucked it beneath his coat. "Because I have a feeling it will become useful." Jack shook his head. "You're beginning to sound like a fortune teller." They headed into the jungle. Behind them, the survivors watched. Ahead lay the trail toward the beach where the wrecked Argosy waited. And, Jack hoped, a way home. The jungle was quieter than Jack remembered. The three followed the trail they had used the previous day. Every few minutes, Jack checked his compass. The needle pointed steadily toward the coast. "How much farther?" Reed asked. "Another hour." Finch stopped. Jack turned. "What?" Finch was staring at the ground. "These weren't here yesterday." Jack walked back. There, pressed into the soft earth, were footprints. Large footprints. 6 toes on each foot. Reed crouched beside them. "They're fresh." Jack looked toward the trees. "How fresh?" Reed touched the mud. "Very." Finch smiled. Jack didn't. "Don't." Finch stood. "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." The tracks continued alongside the trail. They didn't cross it. They followed it. Jack stopped. "Something's watching us." Reed looked around. "How can you tell?" "Because whatever made those tracks keeps making sure we know they're there." A bird suddenly burst from the trees. All three reached for their weapons. Nothing followed it. Jack waited, then lowered his rifle. "Keep moving." They continued. The jungle gradually thinned. Through the trees they could see the ocean, and beyond it, the dark shape of the Argosy. The wreck was still there. Jack smiled. "Looks like our luck finally changed." Then he saw the trail. It led away from the jungle, straight toward the wreck. But it wasn't made by 6-toed feet. These were human footprints. Bare feet. Dozens of them. Reed stared. "Those aren't ours." Finch stepped closer. "How old?" Jack shook his head. "Doesn't matter." He pointed toward the trees. "Someone lives here." A sound came from behind them. Jack spun around. Nothing. Another sound came from the opposite side. A rustle. Then silence. Reed whispered, "We're surrounded." Jack slowly raised his rifle. "Don't shoot unless you have to." Finch looked from tree to tree. "Captain." "I know." A figure stepped from the jungle. Jack frozen. The stranger was human, at least mostly. Dark hair, bare feet, a simple woven garment, and 6 toes. The stranger held a long spear. Then another appeared. Then another. Within seconds, perhaps a dozen people stood among the trees. None spoke. Every one of them carried a weapon. Jack slowly lowered his rifle. The nearest stranger raised his spear. Jack raised both hands. "We don't want trouble." The man stared at him. Jack tried again. "We're lost." Nothing. He pointed toward the ocean, then toward himself, then made a rough motion with his hands, mimicking a ship. The man's expression didn't change. He said something, a short sentence in a language Jack had never heard. Jack looked at Reed. Reed shook his head. Not a word. Finch stepped forward. "I may be able to—" Jack grabbed his arm. "Don't." Finch looked offended. I'm trying to communicate. You're trying to get closer to the man holding the spear. Finch considered this. Fair point. The stranger pointed toward the jungle, then toward Jack. Then he shook his head. Jack frowned. No? The man nodded. Jack pointed toward the ocean again. We need to get to our ship. The stranger shook his head. More of the tribe emerged from the trees. The path toward the wreck was completely blocked. Jack lowered his hands. So that's how it's going to be? Reed quietly said, Jack. Jack looked at him. Yes? I don't think they're asking us. The nearest tribesman raised his spear and took one step forward. Jack kept his hands where the tribesmen could see them. Nobody moved. The jungle seemed to have gone silent around them. Jack slowly pointed toward the ocean again. Our ship. He pointed to himself. Us. Then he pointed toward the wreck. Food. Supplies. The tribesmen watched him carefully. Then he spoke. Jack understood nothing. Finch stepped forward. He raised his hands and spoke slowly. We mean no harm. The tribesmen stared at him. Finch tried again. We come from the ship. He pointed toward the argosy. The tribesmen looked toward the wreck. For a moment, Jack thought he'd understood. Then the man shook his head. He pointed back toward the jungle. No. Jack frowned. Why? The man answered with another sentence. Finch listened carefully. I don't recognize the language. Jack looked around at the others. Every spear remained pointed toward them. Well, Professor, perhaps you can save the language lesson for later. Finch ignored him. He pointed toward the tribesman's spear, then toward his own rifle. He carefully lowered the rifle to the ground. See? He stepped back. We don't want to fight. The tribesman looked at the rifle, then at Finch. He said something to the others. Several of them lowered their weapons slightly. Jack noticed. Good. He slowly removed his pistol and placed it on the ground beside the rifle. Reed followed. Finch hesitated. Jack looked at him. Professor. Finch sighed and placed his own weapon down. For a moment, it seemed to work. Then one of the younger tribesmen noticed the expedition journal sticking out from Finch's coat. He pointed. Finch pulled it out. The man's eyes widened. He shouted something. Every spear came back up. Put that away, Jack shouted. Finch quickly tucked the journal back beneath his coat. What happened? I don't know. Jack stared at the tribesmen. One of them pointed toward Finch, then toward the jungle. Then he made a gesture that looked almost like opening a door. Finch went pale. Jack noticed. You recognize that? Perhaps. Perhaps? The gesture, Finch looked toward the mountain, resembles something in the ruins. Jack closed his eyes. Of course it does. A sharp cry came from somewhere dapper in the jungle. The tribesmen all turned. Jack watched their expressions change. They were no longer looking at the three strangers. They were looking toward the trees. The nearest warrior raised his spear. Another shouted. Then came a second cry, much closer. Reed whispered, What is that? Jack picked up his rifle. I don't know. He looked at the tribesmen. For once, I think we're all about to find out. The tribesmen moved first. They spread through the trees with practiced speed. Jack watched them disappear into the jungle. They know something, Reed said. Definitely. Finch was still staring after them. They were afraid. Jack looked at him. You noticed that too? Yes. A low growl rolled through the trees. Jack raised his rifle. Reed stepped closer. That doesn't sound like anything I've heard before. Neither did the ship breaking apart. Another growl. This time it came from behind them. Jack spun. The jungle erupted. Something crashed through the undergrowth. Jack fired. The shot cracked across the clearing. The creature vanished back into the trees. Reed stared. What did you hit? Nothing. That's reassuring. A spear suddenly flew past Jack's shoulder and buried itself in a tree. Jack ducked. Warn me next time. One of the tribesmen shouted something from the jungle. Another answered. Then came a series of sharp whistles. The creatures in the trees began moving. Fast. Jack could hear them circling. He backed toward Reed and Finch. Stay together. Gladly, Reed said. Finch looked toward the jungle. I think they're driving it somewhere. Who's driving what? Finch pointed. The tribesmen were moving through the trees, shouting and banging their weapons against the trunks. Whatever was hiding there was being forced toward the clearing. A huge shape burst through the foliage. For one brief second, Jack saw it clearly. A massive, four-legged animal, long jaws, dark hide, far too large to be any ordinary jungle predator. It charged. Jack raised his rifle. Before he could fire, 3 spears struck the ground directly in front of the creature. It veered sideways. Another spear struck its shoulder. The animal roared and disappeared into the jungle. The tribesmen gave chase. Their shouting faded into the trees. Jack lowered his rifle. Nobody spoke. Reed finally broke the silence. "I believe we're alive because they wanted us to be." Jack looked at him. "Or because they wanted that thing alive." Finch adjusted his glasses. "Either way, I think we've learned something." Jack sighed. "What's that?" Finch looked toward the jungle. "They aren't the most dangerous thing on this island." Jack stared at him. Then he looked toward the path leading to the wreck. The tribesmen were already returning, and judging by the way they were looking at the 3 strangers, Jack suspected their journey to the Argosy was over for today. The tribesmen returned to the clearing. The large creature was gone. So were the 3 spears that had struck the ground. One of the warrior pointed toward the jungle, then toward Jack, then toward the village. Jack shook his head. He pointed toward the ocean. The warrior shook his head. Jack pointed toward the wreck. Again, the same answer. No. Reed leaned toward Jack. "I think we're going with them." "I noticed." Finch looked almost pleased. "Perhaps this is an opportunity." Jack glanced at him. "Professor, if you say the word archaeology, I'm leaving you here." Finch said nothing. Jack looked at Reed. "You stay between us." "Why?" "Because you're the only one I trust to stop either of us from doing something stupid." Reed smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." The 3 surrendered their weapons. The tribesmen gathered them up. Then they started into the jungle. Jack kept track of the direction they traveled. At least, he tried. After 10 minutes, the trail disappeared completely. They crossed a stream, passed beneath a rocky overhang, then climbed a narrow path Jack hadn't noticed on the way in. Finally, the trees opened. A village sat in the valley below. Jack stopped. It was larger than he'd expected. Perhaps 30 huts stood around a broad clearing. Smoke rose from cooking fires. People worked along the river. Children ran between the houses. Several people were repairing fishing nets. It was not an abandoned settlement. It was alive. Reed looked around. "Well." Jack nodded. "Definitely not ghosts." Finch was staring at the buildings. "They've been here a long time." Jack looked at him. "How long?" "I don't know." "Good." Finch frowned. "You don't have to sound so pleased about it." They were led into the village. People gathered to watch them. Some looked frightened. Others were simply curious. A child approached Jack. The boy stared at him. Jack smiled. "Hello." The child said something. Jack pointed at himself. "Jack." The boy stared, then pointed at himself. He said his name. Jack couldn't understand it, but he nodded anyway. "Good to meet you." The child smiled, then ran away. Reed chuckled. First successful diplomatic exchange. Jack smiled. Progress. Finch wasn't listening. He had noticed something. On the wall of one of the huts was a carved symbol, a circle crossed by 3 lines. Finch stepped closer. Jack saw his expression change. "What?" Finch pointed. Jack looked. The symbol looked familiar. Not exactly, but close. Very close. It resembled one of the markings they'd seen on the ancient ruins. Finch whispered, "Captain." Jack shook his head. "We don't know what it means, but we don't know." Finch reluctantly stepped back. The village elder approached. He was an old man carrying a carved wooden staff. He looked at Jack, then at Finch. His eyes stopped on the journal beneath Finch's coat. The elder's expression hardened. He said something. The tribesmen around them immediately became tense. Jack slowly raised his hands. "Easy." The elder pointed toward the jungle, then toward the mountain. Then he made the same gesture Finch had seen earlier, opening a door. Finch stared. Jack noticed. "Professor?" Finch swallowed. "I think he's trying to tell us something." "What?" Finch looked toward the mountain. "I don't know." The elder turned away. The conversation was over. The sun was beginning to set when the tribe finally released them. Jack had no idea why. Perhaps the elder had decided they weren't dangerous. Perhaps they'd simply decided that 3 unarmed strangers weren't worth keeping. Either way, Jack wasn't going to argue. The tribesmen returned their weapons. Then one of them pointed toward the jungle. Jack understood the message. "Go." Jack nodded. "We're leaving." The warrior pointed again. Jack looked toward the mountain, then back at the warrior. "Yes, we're leaving." The three followed the trail back toward the beach. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, Reed broke the silence. Well, that went better than I expected. Jack looked at him. We were kidnapped. Technically escorted. At spear point. Still technically escorted. Finch smiled. You both missed the important part. Jack groaned. The symbol. The symbol. Finch pulled the journal from his coat. Jack immediately stopped walking. Put that away. Why? Because if those people wanted it, I'd rather they didn't know we still have it. Finch considered this, then put it away. Reed looked at him. Do you think they're connected to the ruins? Finch hesitated. I don't know. Jack nodded. Good. Finch frowned. Why are you so pleased whenever I say that? Because it means we're not inventing answers. They continued walking. The jungle was darkening around them. Then Reed stopped. Jack. Jack turned. Reed pointed toward the trees. Someone was standing there. A young tribesman. He had followed them. Jack raised his hand. The young man stepped forward. He held something. Jack recognized it. His compass. Jack reached for it. The tribesman pulled it away. He pointed toward the compass, then toward the sky, then toward the ocean. Jack frowned. You want us to go? The tribesman shook his head. He pointed toward the compass again, then toward the jungle, then toward the mountain. Finch stepped forward. He's trying to tell us something. Jack sighed. Of course he is. The tribesman placed the compass on the ground, then walked back into the jungle. Jack picked it up. The needle spun wildly, then settled. Not north, not south. It pointed directly toward the mountain. Reed stared. That's odd. Finch smiled. Very. Jack closed the compass. We're still going to the wreck tomorrow. Finch looked disappointed. Yes. Jack looked toward the mountain. But after that, he paused. We'll see. The three continued toward the beach. Behind them, hidden among the trees, the young tribesman watched until they were gone. Then he turned toward the mountain and disappeared into the jungle. By the time Jack, Reed, and Finch returned to camp, the sun was already beginning its descent. The survivors gathered around them. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. Jack gave them the short version. We found people. That immediately started a dozen questions. How many? Where? Are they friendly? Jack held up a hand. Let's start with the important part. They're alive, they're organized, and they don't want us wandering around their territory. And the wreck? One of the sailors asked. Jack shook his head. Didn't reach it. A disappointed murmur went through the group. Then someone near the far end of camp shouted, Captain! Jack turned. Two of the castaways were standing beside a pile of wreckage. Between them was a small wooden boat. Jack walked over. It had probably been a lifeboat once. One side was badly scraped, several boards were cracked, and one of the oars was missing. But the hull looked sound. Jack crouched beside it. Where did you find this? Washed up farther down the beach, the sailor said. We found it this afternoon. Reed examined the damaged side. It'll float. Jack looked at him. That's all I needed to hear. Finch walked around the boat. Can it carry all of us? No. Jack stood. But it doesn't have to. He pointed toward the wreck. We only need to get back aboard the Argosy. Several of the castaways exchanged hopeful looks. Jack continued. There's rope aboard, timber, tools, canvas, maybe even another lifeboat. He looked over the beach. If we can get enough material off her, we can build something bigger. A raft? Jack nodded. A raft. That changed the mood of the camp. Suddenly everyone had a job. One man repaired the cracked boards. Another searched for rope. Reed organized what little medical supplies they had left. Even Finch got put to work. Jack handed him an oar. Hold this. Finch looked at it. Captain, I'm an archaeologist. Today, you're an oarsman. Finch sighed. I've had better days. Jack smiled. So have I. By sunset, the boat was ready. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't comfortable, but it floated. And tomorrow morning, they would use it to reach the Argosy. Jack stood at the water's edge that evening, looking toward the wreck. The ship was barely visible against the darkening sea. We'll get what we need, Reed said beside him. Jack nodded. We have to. Finch joined them. And then? Jack looked at the wreck. Then we build our way home. The next morning, the little boat slipped into the water. Jack took the oars. Reed sat in the bow. A young sailor named Harris sat behind them, keeping watch on the camp. Finch remained on shore. Jack had decided that 3 men in a damaged lifeboat were enough. The Argosy grew larger as they rowed. For the first time since the crash, Jack felt something approaching optimism. The wreck still had plenty to offer: food, rope, tools, wood, perhaps even a working radio. And if they were lucky, they might find enough material to build a raft capable of carrying everyone. Reed looked back toward the island. The others are watching. Jack glanced over his shoulder. The castaways stood along the beach, waiting. Jack raised one hand. Several waved back. He turned toward the wreck. "Let's get this done." They rowed closer. The Argosy towered above them. Then Reed heard something. "Jack." "What?" "Stop." Jack stopped rowing. The little boat drifted. "What is it?" Reed listened. There it was again, a low mechanical rumble. Jack looked toward the far side of the wreck. A thin plume of smoke rose above the hull. His expression changed. "That's an engine." Reed stood carefully. Could someone have survived? Jack grabbed the binoculars. He looked. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he lowered them. Not ours. A motorboat emerged from behind the Argosy. It was fast, modern, and completely unlike anything that had belonged to the survivors. 3 men were aboard, perhaps 4. Jack raised the binoculars again. Weapons, rifles. One man stood at the front of the boat, scanning the wreck. Another was examining the shoreline. Reed whispered, "Who are they?" Jack didn't answer. The motorboat slowed. One of the men raised binoculars. Jack immediately lowered his own. "Get down." Reed dropped into the bottom of the boat. Harris ducked behind the side. The 3 men remained still. The motorboat drifted closer. Jack looked toward the island. It was too far away. The motorboat was between them and the wreck, and whatever these men were doing here, they clearly hadn't come to rescue anyone. The man with the binoculars suddenly turned. His gaze swept across the water. Jack held his breath. The binoculars stopped. Directly on them. The man lowered them. He said something to the others. The engine revved. Jack slowly reached for the oars. Reed whispered, "What do we do?" Jack stared at the approaching boat, then at the Argosy, then back toward the distant beach, where the castaways had no idea what was happening. He tightened his grip on the oar. Row. The motorboat accelerated.